So my name is Raffaello Pantucci. I'm Director of International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute, a think tank in London. Here today I'm talking about China and China's role in Iraq and China's broader relationships in the Middle East. And I think that's an important way to sort of think about China's relations with Iraq within the broader context of the Middle East. China has done a sort of impressive job in many ways of, over the years, maintaining a sort of consistent positive relationship with most actors in the Middle East in one way or another. And this is because China's put forward a very simple proposition to the region, which was most cleanly articulated, I think, by President Xi in 2015 when he talked about a 1-2-3 policy towards the Middle East. 1 was energy, 2 was infrastructure, and 3 was high tech. And sort of looking forwards. And these 3 sort of principles, and very much in that order, have been China's clear interests and expressions of interest within the Middle East, particularly within Iraq, where you can see that China is one of the major oil trading partners for the country. And from China's perspective, Iraq accounts for, I think, about 9% of their oil imports. So it's an important sort of energy relationship, which is the foundation, but you increasingly see now that China is coming in to build infrastructure. And you can see at the last round of discussions in Kuwait, I believe, which were looking at trying to raise money for investment into infrastructure in Iraq, China was one of the major, I think, contributors to that pot. And I think going forwards, you're going to see more Chinese companies, more Chinese investment within this regard coming in. And I think all of this is interesting to think about within the broader context of Chinese foreign policy. And in many ways, what you're seeing there is a quite clean articulation of, on the ground, of the broader Belt and Road Initiative, which is President Xi Jinping's big keynote foreign policy initiative. Announced back in 2013 with a speech in Astana in Kazakhstan and then a speech in Jakarta in Indonesia. The Belt and Road Initiative is kind of Xi Jinping's foreign policy concept idea, which he has sort of gifted to the world. And at its root, it is about building trade and economics corridors emanating out from China, going in all directions to ultimately bring the world to China and bring China to the world. And in many ways, this is done through infrastructure construction, and this is done through the import of natural resources back to China. And nowhere cleaner can we see this in Iraq, where we can see this very clean sort of balance going on. We have to think of the Belt and Road less as a specific project with specific things that are happening along it, but more of as a concept. And the concept is one of trade and economics corridors, and routes and roads and building up of infrastructure. And I think it would be difficult for me to point to specific projects that are necessarily going to do this. But what I would instead say is look at any project you see happening in Iraq in the next few years that's Chinese invested and Chinese supported, or with Chinese companies implementing it, and you will almost always find some reference to the Belt and Road in the articulation of that project and its expression on the ground. I think that from Iraq's perspective, it is going to be an interesting relationship to manage going forwards. I think that China's sort of consistently shown itself as an actor within the country, a consistent investor, a consistent purchaser of energy, also increasingly a source of military hardware. If you look at some of the recent UAVs and drone technology that China is selling, Iraq is deploying this in the field. Interestingly, you can also see ISIS using Chinese drone technology in the field as well. But you can see that there is a broader relationship that is starting to sort of develop. And I think going forwards, that will only sort of increase. The question will be for Iraq and for the Iraqi government, the degree to which they will want to welcome this Chinese investment, or the degree to which they will feel that they will have to choose sides. If potentially we see the conflict between the United States and China sort of escalating and getting worse, it's possible that you will see a sense of having to sort of choose sides within some of these contexts, and within Iraq in particular. And with a strong relationship with the United States and the West, it's possible that you might see them being forced to choose. But personally, I struggle to see that. I think that you'll broadly see the Iraqi government will find a way of steering this through, and I think China will avoid forcing people to particularly choose sides. It will focus very much on the 1-2-3 model of energy, infrastructure, and high tech in the future. When you're thinking about how do you connect with this Chinese investment potentially coming into a country like Iraq? I would argue it's probably the same principles that you're seeing in lots of other places, which is that oftentimes the way these deals are constructed is a Chinese loan to the government that is arranged by a sort of policy bank doing a state-driven enterprise of lending to the country. The country will then have a stipulation within that contract that they have to hire a Chinese company to come and implement X project on the ground. And so there is that kind of closed loop in some ways of Chinese money paying for Chinese companies to come and do a project in a third location. Where is the entry point for a foreign company coming into this? Well, I think there's a few that companies should focus on. The first is niche capabilities. UK companies in particular, for example, do have things that Chinese companies cannot do. I know in the energy sector, some of the high-tech elements of the energy sector in construction, in certain parts of sort of pipe construction, there are British companies that are sort of peerless, frankly, in the world. And so CNPC and CNOOC and others will use these British companies to do that. And so there is a kind of natural thing there, identifying where you have a technical expertise, which frankly the Chinese companies do not, which they need. That is a clear sort of meshing of interests. The other is, I think, big, and this is probably most relevant for multinationals really, who have a long footprint in Beijing already. From that perspective, look to where you can see your Chinese partners are going out into the world and work with them in those third locations. You know, the Belt and Road Strategy in some ways is just another articulation of China going out, right? Which is China going out into the world and China's companies being pushed out into the world. And if you can find ways of connecting, if you're operating or have a deep knowledge of a country like Iraq, where your Chinese partner is looking to go, well, making sure you can kind of connect up those dots means that you'll be in a position to help that company go out and help win a part of the contract that they want to go deliver in that country. The third way I would focus on is to think about what comes next. So when you think of energy infrastructure, energy and oil, actually it's a fairly closed loop. You know, you're really talking about a sort of an industry where you build the refinery, you build a factory to pump the oil, and then you build the roads to get the oil out, and then you kind of, job's done, right? But if you look at some of the other infrastructure, you think of rail, you think of roads, you think of ports. In all of these, you know, the Chinese company will often come and deliver the project, but they won't deliver what comes next. And it's what comes next that the country really needs to focus on if they want to take advantage of this infrastructure. So if you build a road doesn't necessarily develop an economy. What does develop an economy is building, you know, refrigeration units along the way, so your farmers can use the road usefully. It's building petrol stations along the way, and others can come in and do that. So it's thinking about what is the infrastructure that's actually happening, and how can I, as a foreign company, see that there's opportunities there to do the next kind of wave or the next step investment. And focusing on that in particular is a kind of long-term aspect which will be hugely beneficial to the country and is a real opportunity for others. Chinese companies have got a remarkably high risk-hold. They're willing to go to environments where frankly the rest of us would not. There's all sorts of anecdotes you can look at where you've got quite big Chinese companies that have gone into very dangerous places, and they have sort of cut a path that others were not sort of willing to do because it was a developing market, because they saw an opportunity, because they were willing to take that risk and do that. So I actually think that, yeah, now almost if you look at the history of Chinese investment, you know, it's basically an upward trajectory of Chinese investment and trade with Iraq. It did sort of blip a little, I think, in 2014 and seems to be down at the moment, but I would suspect it's probably going to go back up again. The degree to which people were talking in positive terms about how things have changed over the sort of long arc of history and how more stable parts of the country are than I think outsiders will necessarily know. I was struck, I must say, by some of the comments around inequalities and corruption feeding these inequalities and that anger at a sort of public lower level and at a sort of younger level towards the sort of elites who are perceived as being the same ones, who are perceived as being relatively corrupt, and the sort of tension that that creates. And that tension is one that we can see all over the world these days, but I think it's interesting to see it articulating itself in a place like Iraq as well. I do also, I must say, hold some concern about some of the sectarian aspects that I think were raised this morning in terms of the government and how the new government is being constructed and what's happening with the elections in the country, because I think those sectarian tensions are probably at the root of what let Daesh, ISIS, really take root in that country. And I fear if they're not managed, it will just return, because I think there are some pretty fundamental issues still at play. And I think from what I heard this morning, it sounded to me like things at the moment seem to be moving in a more positive trajectory, but I do worry about some of those underlying issues. And if some of those underlying issues, be they inequalities, being sectarian tensions, are not addressed, you're going to see the same kind of eruption in a few years' time maybe come up again.